problem solving. Okay, what is the problem with this? Why do so many people find this so hard, right? These are some of the statements that we have heard from a lot of our students who prepare for SAT, right? So typically, people get stuck with something like word problems, or they feel that, what, if you give me enough time, I can crack this question. But in the context of the exam, where there is this timer that is ticking, that pressure is something that I cannot handle, and I'm not able to get the question accurately in a short span of time, right? There are also a lot of people who say, I make a lot of careless errors, right? So I do stuff like 2 into 3 is equal to 5 kind of mistakes, and this hurts my overall score. So this is usually, the biggest problem, where you actually know how to solve the problem and you make just one careless slip somewhere, and that ends up costing you the entire question, right? So is this something that you guys can relate to, right? If you have anything similar, or if you have any other pain points, please feel free to share them on the chat, right? We would love to hear what kind of problems you're facing, right? But these are some of the common problems that a lot of the students face, and we're going to be focusing on how to try and overcome this problem, right? So I'm going to take a detour and look at problem solving at an abstract level, right? So how would we typically go about solving a problem, right? If you notice, it's actually just a bunch of steps that we follow every time. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to call out those steps, right? So at first glance, this might seem very trivial, okay? So typically, how do you approach a problem, right? So you would start by defining the problem, right? Notice I'm not even talking about a problem specific to SAT. It could be any kind of a problem, right? It could be something that you're studying in your school and you want to solve that, or whatever it is, right? You start by defining exactly what the problem is, right? And then the next step is you think about the problem, right? You're trying to see if you know anything already that you can use to solve this problem, right? So based on this, your creative juices are kicking, and you're trying to see connect different areas of knowledge and trying to see if any of them will be useful in solving this problem, right? So once you do that, you're going to try and plan a solution. So how are you going to approach? So once you've understood that, hey, this is probably the concept that I need to use, this is how I'm going to use it, right? So that's what you come up with next. You come up with a plan for solving the problem, right? And once you do that, now you're going to actually execute the plan, right? So you come up with a plan, you're going to try and execute it, and you're going to look back at step 1 to check if whatever you have come up with, whatever you've got as an answer, does it really answer the problem, right? Does it solve the problem effectively? If yes, you're done. But if not, you might have to go back into this loop again, right? So if you look at these steps again at a very high level, it kind of seems pretty straightforward, right? So you start by defining the problem, and then you think about the problem, then you plan a solution, and then you execute the solution, and then you look back at your problem's definition and see if you have been successful or not, right? If you're not successful, then you might have to go back to any step in that loop again. Okay, makes sense at a very high level? Okay, now let's look at what these steps are in a little bit more detail and how we can use this in our problem solving that you would do on the test, right? Okay, so let's look at defining the problem. So what are the things that you should consider while trying to define the problem? Now, the first step is to understand what is asked in the question clearly, right? You need to make sure that you understand what is asked in the question, and if necessary, you restate it in your own terms so that it's clear in your head as to what is being asked. Okay. Now, look at the problem and then figure out what are all the givens, what are all the knowns, right? And what are all the unknowns. Now, this is one crucial point that we emphasize to a lot of our students. Use some kind of a visualization, right? So that you can represent the information given in the question. The reason is because this simple visualization will give you a lot of clarity. And once you have that clarity, that's like half the battle won, right? So if you define the problem well, 50% of your job is done, right? So this is an extremely important skill, and I'll speak more about this in a little bit. And another thing is to watch out for any units given in the question. And finally, make sure that you define what is the criteria for success. As in, you need to know, okay, if I get this, then I have solved the problem, or this is what is asked in the question. So make sure that you call that out and say, this is what I'm looking for. This is the criteria for success. Because without this criteria for success, you're not going to be able to look back at step one and see if you have actually succeeded or not, right? So make sure you call out this criteria for success. Okay, so that's the first step, to define the problem. Okay, so once you do that, you're going to be thinking about the problem. So what do you mean by this? So this is the step where you're trying to see what are the things that you already know which could be related to this problem, which can be used in solving this problem, right? So you're going to try and make connections between, specific concepts that you already know, and you're trying to see how that can be connected to the problem at hand, right? Now, here is another critical thing to think of, right? When you're thinking about this problem, check if there are some traps in the question, right, that you need to be aware of. Are there some superfluous information that is given to you to distract you? Or have they asked for something very specific which you can actually get without even solving the entire, trying to figure out all the unknowns, right? So sometimes it might be possible to, by just thinking about the problem, you might very quickly narrow down on what the right answer is, right? So in that sense, step 2 is extremely critical. Okay, and this could also be the point where you check, hey, you know what? This problem seems to be related to concepts that I'm not yet, that I have not yet encountered, right? So you may feel that, you're not confident of solving this problem, in which case you're probably better off moving on to the next question, right? So the reason why I suggest this is because a test like SAT, there is no penalty for incorrect answers, right? But you're trying to maximize the number of correct answers, right? So you're better off in trying to solve as many questions as you can correctly, as opposed to getting stuck on some hard question and not moving on, and then losing time that, that is time that you could have spent on some of the other questions which you may be good at, right? So one thing to be aware of is to say, you know what, I don't know this concept, I need to move on, right? So that is also something that you would consider in this step, right? So once you've defined the problem and once you've thought about it for a little bit of time, if you feel that you're not confident, you're better off skipping the question and going to the next one, right? But if you're able to understand what is related, what are the concepts that are related to the question, right, then you can move on to the next step, which is to plan a solution, right? Now, there could be multiple strategies for a given problem. There is no one single method to arrive at a particular answer. So there could be multiple strategies, right? You could compute, you could simplify, you could frame an equation, or sometimes you can work backwards by looking at the answer choices, right? So we will look at some of these strategies in a bit, okay, while we're solving those problems. And so for some of the questions, I will also try to give you a couple of different approaches so that you understand how to think in a slightly out of the box manner, right? So your goal is to identify the best strategy that will give you the answer accurately and in the shortest possible time. Please remember that the first criteria is to get the answer accurately, okay, not necessarily the fastest one, right? Sometimes you might find that there is a slightly longer method, but one that will give you your answer quickly. So we'll discuss more about this later on, right? So once you plan a solution, then you move on and you try to execute the solution. So this is usually the simplest step in this process, right? If you have the understanding of what it is that you're trying to do, and if you know the concepts, right, you should be able to do this really well. The only warning is to work carefully, right? Don't be in a haste. You just need to make sure that you're not making any careless mistakes, or you shouldn't be making any unstated assumptions, right? Which is again brings back to step number one, which is defining the problem well. If you defined your problem well, then you wouldn't be making these unstated assumptions. Okay, and finally, look back at the step and look at the success criteria and see if your answer makes sense, right? And ensure that you have actually answered the question completely, right? So another thing that we try to say is when you're in the prep period, as in when you're not taking, this is not about the actual exam, but when you're preparing for the test, when you're in the prep mode, one thing that we always ask people to look at is think of other ways to solve the problem after solving the problem as well. Why? Because you might realize, like with hindsight, you might find that, you know what, if I had done it this way, I would have gotten this answer faster. Okay, and that could be a very useful lesson, okay, and it would get etched in your memory when you do it just after solving the problem. If you try to think of more ways of doing it, it will actually stick to you in a manner that it would be much better than someone else coming and telling you another method, right? So if you can find out another method to solve it on your own, right, that would be that would stick to you for a much longer time, right? And also try to think of what you learned from this problem, right? Because what you learn from one problem can be applied elsewhere, right? So this would, if you were able to understand what you learned from solving this problem, or if you were to arrive at some key ideas, those ideas can be used while solving other problems as well, right? So looking back at step one is something which is very critical. So during the exam, it helps in making sure that you're actually answering the question completely and you're not making those careless errors. And during the prep period, this step can be used to achieve a few more things, such as identifying other approaches to the same problem. Okay, so those are the 5 different steps that you need to follow while solving a problem.